There's a great scholar, the scholar who molded me the most, reading his book, Destruction of Black Civilization, used to say. His name is Chancellor Williams. And he used to say, the African historian must be on a relentless search for truth and must not tremble with fear when that truth is contrary to what we would prefer to believe. I think that our ancestors who were taken out of the door of no return, who were captured and enslaved and brought to America, our ancestors who were raped and brutalized and nearly exterminated by Europeans, they deserve the truth. I think that we owe them honesty.
I have another question. The Olmecs, you were talking about the genetics of these people that live in Native Americans, that they vary widely. But the Olmecs seem to have very similar features, the thick lips, the wide noses. Why do we think that is?
Well, this is part of a curious mystery that is not unconnected to the genetic mystery.
The very first native civilization in the Americas is known as Olmec civilization. This civilization occurs in the Gulf Coast of Mexico. When we speak of Mexico, however, you must get it very clear in your mind that we're not speaking of the shrunken Mexico of today. We speak of Mexico when it was the very core and heartland of Native American civilizations. A Mexico that included parts of Colorado, parts of Texas, parts of California, going right up to La Plata in Canada. This civilization known as Olmec was to touch all other civilizations in America. The Maya, the Toltec, the Aztec, etc. It was even to stretch right out into South America.
But if Columbus doesn't come until 1492, several of his voyages are in 1492, and Pizarro and Balboa and these guys, that doesn't necessarily indicate an ancient trade.
What is very unusual about this civilization was that not only was it the mother of American civilizations, but it contained elements that were not just native to America, but was a fusion between the Native American and people coming from outside. The most significant of those outsiders were the Africans.
Dr. Van Sertima points out in They Came Before Columbus that Native Americans that Europeans encountered indicated that they had been trading with Africans for a very long time.
We have very clear evidence in stone heads, in terracottas that are clay sculptures, as well as skulls and skeletons of an African physical type entering that native population, somewhere between 948 and 680 BC.
This is part of a curious mystery that is not unconnected to the genetic mystery. It's been known by archaeologists for quite a long time that there are anomalous skulls in parts of Brazil, which appear to show very strongly Polynesian or African features, very much like the features that we see on the Olmec heads.
Of an African physical type entering that native population. How do we know the date? It is because on one of the platforms in the holy center and capital of the Olmec world, a place called the Venta, we were able to date the stone heads because they were rooted in a wooden platform where the Americans worshipped, and we got this dating of 948 to 680 BC.
So we talked about the African presence in Mesoamerican civilization. And then you have African people who probably came to the Americas much later. For example, Balboa, one of the Spanish conquistadors, identified a black community, which he called Ethiopian, in the Darien Peninsula of Panama in 1513.
Ferdinand Columbus wrote a book in his path. He said, "My father told me he saw Negroes north of Honduras." And then I found that Vasco Nunez de Balboa in September 25th in the year 1513, coming down the slopes of Guaracua, which is in Darien, which we now call Panama, actually saw two tall black men among the Native Americans. The Spanish were startled. These men were about 1.5 feet taller than the Native American. They were exceedingly black. They had a different texture of hair, different features. And they asked the Native Americans where these black men come from. And they said, "We don't know, but they're in a large settlement nearby. We're waging war with them, and we've captured these two." Several people commented that. Peter Martyr, one of the first historians of America, said that these black people must have been shipwrecked long ago from Africa and had taken refuge in these mountains.
And a number of archaeologists who got into trouble with their colleagues for this have used that to argue many years ago, 30, 40 years ago, that the settlement story of the Americas is much more complicated than we've realized.
And actually, my anticipation, as I said, is a sort of a cultural unification. Even some cultures came from the other side of the ocean, some cultures were here already, like the Olmecs. And they are considered probably the roots of the Africans because of the negroid features on their big heads that were left around.
You see, what happened with those African or Polynesian-looking skulls was that they were tested for DNA when DNA technology was not as advanced as it is today. And what that DNA showed was that they were more closely related to modern Native Americans than they are to any other people in the world. So the notion that there was some connection with Polynesia or Africa was dismissed. But now that we have very firm evidence of an Australasian genetic signal, Australian Aborigines, Papua New Guinea, Melanesians, with those kind of features. Now that we have the genetic evidence that is found in the Amazon, we have to go back to that old evidence. And what the DNA is doing is it's telling us that there was something really weird happened with settlement.
Remember now, we're looking at thousands of years, so it's dangerous to generalize and lump it together like it all happened within a space of a few years, or that Africans are monolithic.
Now, several people have wondered what kind of Africans these were. Who were these outsiders? These were largely Egypto-Nubian types. At least that type was in command. Because what we do find in evidence is that not merely the presence of this physical type, which is African, but the presence of cultural elements, which we will talk about in this program, which are clearly of Egypto-Nubian origin. This is very important because it's important to understand that the Egyptian thing, the Egyptian miracle, was not only to touch Europe, not only to touch Asia, but was to stretch out to America as well.
Africa is closer to America than Europe is. And it's been proven that if you get on the right current from West Africa, you're going to sail to America whether you want to or not. If you have enough food and water and you get on a raft, you'll end up in the Americas. It may take you a month or 2 months. So the idea that Africans were not in America is really preposterous. If Europeans could come, and Europe is farther from America than Africa is, and the current, I mean, on one of his voyages, Columbus even came from the west coast of Africa, I think from the Gulf of Guinea.
Then you have Africans who are captured and brought to the Americas against their will.
The South Carolina should probably change its name to Chicora, or some people would write it Shakori or Shakora. The reason for that is because the first Africans were brought to Chicora by the Spanish in the 1520s. They accompanied a Spanish expedition which was basically looking for slaves, but also intended to establish a settlement.
And what is most important, I think, for us to emphasize is that there was constant resistance.
The Africans rebelled, and the Spaniards left. They had some fighting with the native people in the area, and the Africans rebelled and remained behind. This was in the 1520s. So these are the first permanent non-Native American settlers in continental North America, long before St. Augustine and long before Jamestown. And that area was known as Chicora at that time, which probably comes from the Shakori native people.
You know, and so I'm very down on a lot of the people who, in my opinion, are simply making history up. And I don't think that makes us look good. I think it makes us look foolish. And so there are many people today who create a kind of a fiction or romantic version of history that doesn't correspond to reality. And so when I hear about the Moors in ancient America and the Moors drawing maps, and I don't see any evidence of that, I shy away from that. I think that our ancestors who were taken out of the door of no return, who were captured and enslaved and brought to America, our ancestors who were raped and brutalized and nearly exterminated by Europeans, they deserve the truth. I think that we owe them honesty, and not just to say things that make us look good. You know, and so I'm very down on a lot of the people who, in my opinion, are simply making history up.
The very first major civilization in the Americas is known as Olmec civilization. This civilization occurs in the Gulf Coast of Mexico. When we speak of Mexico, however, you must get it very clear in your mind that we're not speaking of the strong